this panel, we have just a variety of different perspectives from different disciplines on this IP alert system. We have full biographies over on the table over there, so we're not going to take up a lot of time introducing people. I'll just briefly introduce them and let them talk, and then we'll give our first panelists first dibs on at the end kind of responding to anything they want to respond to, and open it up again for questions. So again, we'll try to do about 15 minutes per speaker or less, so however much you want. And so here we have Nick Feamster.
Thanks, Chris. I wanted to briefly introduce myself, since many of you probably haven't seen me here before. I've done that here before. So I work in network security. I'm a computer scientist. I work in network security and network operations. The work that I do is primarily with network operators. In particular, we look at many different types of, we develop many different types of technologies to improve network availability and performance, both in the face of accidental types of faults like misconfiguration of routers, misconfiguration of the network, as well as malice or intentional performance degradations. So work in many different areas. In particular, I've done a lot of work in spam filtering, and in particular, what I'll talk about as it relates to what we'll speak about today is some methods that involve detecting spam and malware without actually looking at the content of the traffic. Also doing quite a bit of work in the last few years on transparency and anti-censorship. In the first panel, of course, there was a little bit of discussion on network neutrality, and from the technical world, we try not to take a stance on sort of one side or the other of a lot of these issues, but rather provide people technology to, in particular, consumers and ISPs technology to give them more information, to make policies more transparent so that they can make informed decisions. I also work in various other areas. In particular, another one of note is economics in particular, we've done some analysis of tiered pricing of internet for internet connectivity. So I had some thoughts that I'm happy to share during the panel about that. In particular, there were some comments that came up in the first panel about whether or not it makes good economic sense to boot users off the network. I think maybe we can talk a little bit more about that. But for my panel position, I'm just gonna stick to one question, which was posed, I think, in the teaser to the panel, which was that the question was, well, ISPs already provide some value to consumers by helping them detect spam, malware, so forth. So here's an example of that. Comcast, for example, I know there's some people from Comcast here, provided a product to their users, basically, that helps them figure out whether or not there are machines on their network that happen to be compromised. And this was sort of a question that was posed to the panel was, okay, well, the ISPs are providing some value to consumers here in doing things like alerting them about compromises, cleaning up spam, alerting them about malware on the network. Is this just the same thing? Is this just sort of the next logical extension? And I'm not here to sort of say whether or not we should or shouldn't be doing this, but I thought I'd mainly just offer a sort of technical perspective and say this is not necessarily the same thing. It's not necessarily a straight logical extension. In particular, a lot of the things that can be done to alert users about the presence of malware, spam, phishing domains, etc., can be done without actually looking at the content of the traffic itself. There are many different ways to do these types of things, but actually, yes.
That was at the network level. They're not trying to sell that to their customers to do it themselves.
They actually do send the consumers alerts.
But the security is at the network level.
The security
informing here.
They are informing the user that there's some device on their home network, for example, that appears to be compromised. Then it's a question of what needs to be done done about that. So it's an alert, similar to the types of alerts we were talking about before, but the mechanisms by which, so that's, I guess, one similarity. There are alerting systems already in place. The mechanisms by which an ISP might discover information about whether or not a user is compromised, or whether or not a home network is compromised, whether or not spam traffic is coming off the network. Those actually are technically different. It's not a straight logical extension. I think the big difference is that for a lot of these things that ISPs already do to detect malware, spam, phishing domains, etc., it's not actually technically necessary to look at the content of the messages, right? So, and often it's technically not feasible either because there's so much traffic going by, right? So it can be very difficult for an ISP at high speeds to look at every single word and every single data packet that's going by. It's expensive to do that at very high speeds. So what people have spent a lot of time doing over the past 10 or so years is to develop techniques to ferret out good traffic from bad without actually looking at the content. So what they do instead is look at traffic patterns. So a good analogy here would be, for example, let's take spam, right? And an analogy would be like telemarketers, right, in the telephone world. And before you pick up the phone, at dinner time that it's going to be a telemarketer because no one else calls you between 5 and 7 p.m. on a weekday night. You don't have to wait for the hello. I'm here to sell you garbage bags or tell you to vote for so and so. You already know that it's going to be somebody you don't want to talk to. We've worked on research, and ISPs now generally employ techniques that are similar. They don't actually look at the message, right, that's coming. They can tell based on who's sending it, what ISP it's coming from, what time of day it was sent at, so on and so forth. They can use those kind of signals to distinguish good from bad traffic. So the different ways that, and the different domains in which an ISP might want to do this. One is DNS domains, right? So the name that the name that a website owner or a scam artist or a spammer might register, like to get you to click on to listen a URL for you to click on. Those domains sometimes they can be good or bad. Right? We know the good ones. The spammers and the scammers are registering new domains all the time. They need to do this to basically make it tough for them to detect themselves, make it tough for them to be detected. Spam is another area where again ISPs have been looking a lot at sending behavior rather than the content of messages, as I mentioned. And malware is another area where again it's not fully necessary to look at deeply into the contents of the network traffic to detect these types of things. I don't know exactly how constant guard works because I don't work for Comcast, and certainly they haven't told me. But from some knowledge about how similar types of technologies work, this is and from some knowledge about who they buy the technology from. This is basically my best guess at how this type of thing works, and there are certainly detection techniques like this well documented in the research literature. The idea basically is that of course we know what bad traffic looks like, but we want to do something that's more lightweight, more efficient. What we can do actually is there's a process by which a bad DNS domain gets registered, and there's behavior that can be observed about who's issuing lookups for that domain. So everyone looks up Google.com, right? Everyone's basically going to issue searches at that website. But if the scammer registers a brand new domain today, right, then the people who are immediately looking that up, the machines that are looking that up right away, might be suspicious because, how did this strange domain suddenly become so popular from so many different places? So you can do things like look at lookup patterns to try to figure out who's good or bad. In the spam, relating to the spam problem, we've done some research, and Yahoo and Secure Computing and others have sort of picked up similar ideas from work that we've done in this area. The idea basically is what I mentioned before, right? Rather than looking at the contents of the message itself, you can basically figure out good versus bad email traffic. Yeah, even from looking at just like a single packet, right? So it's kind of like the equivalent of like, that first phone ring, right? As soon as the ring happens, you can basically figure some of these things out. No need, and really no desire to look into the contents. It's often it's too expensive, and for many reasons it's often too late. Botnet detection actually works, can work in similar ways as well. And there are companies in this area, Damballa being one of them, that basically notice that actually many internet attacks work in this coordinated fashion. That is, it's often not one machine mounting an attack. Often attacks, and by attack I mean anything from a denial of service attack to sending huge volumes of spam. It's often not launched from a single machine, but it's launched from thousands of machines in a coordinated fashion. So again, network operators can look at coordinated behavior. A huge surge in traffic volume from thousands of different machines to a particular target might be indicative of some suspicious or malicious activity, and they don't actually necessarily have to look at the contents to do that. So this is not to say this is not to really to take a stance on whether or not the 6 strikes is a good or bad thing, but merely to sort of offer some technical perspective to the question that was posed to the panel, which is that the technologies that exist that help ISPs do things like clean up malware, spam, and botnets are not necessarily the same types of things that would be needed or that are necessary for doing this kind of IP enforcement. You may have heard of something called deep packet inspection, and that's actually something that that actually is what an ISP can do. Is technology that enables them to look into the contents of the traffic. And all the things that I mentioned so far don't require deep packet inspection, but IP enforcement might. I think it's worth pointing out in the context of the 6 strikes that there are also other interests, right? And the interests in sort of cleaning up spam and malware and sort of managing the network better may not be the same as the interest behind something like the IP protection as well. There are bandwidth constraints. Someone pointed that out in the first panel, right? Access network performance is already pretty strained. I'll use and content pirates may actually be significant bandwidth hogs. I think someone mentioned that. I'll use this as an opportunity to talk about something that we've been looking at quite extensively. We have a project going on where we deploy custom Netgear routers with custom measurement software on them, and we drop them in people's homes, and then we sort of measure what performance people are seeing from the edge from the edge of the network inside their homes. Obviously, both consumers and ISPs have an interest in this type of question. Here's an example of like an AT&T DSL 3 megabit per second down user, and you can see these are 2 different ways of measuring the throughput. So there are many. I won't get into the technical details here, but you can see basically that there's a little bit of shortfall. What I think the point here is not necessarily to pick on one ISP or not. I think you see similar kinds of, similar amount of shortfall in many of the different ISPs. But to note that actually there are times when, when there are dips, right, when congestion may be occurring in the network. And I think this comes to a thought I had from the first panel, which was someone said, well, it'd be better if we just, if we could just get these users off, the network. And I think congestion and bandwidth constraints are certainly a concern, but there are other ways to potentially explore this as well besides just getting the users off the network. For example, looking at price discrimination as a way to force users to shift their behavior to less loaded times, right? Because it's certainly the case that the network performs better during off-peak hours. Someone mentioned this as well, so I won't belabor it. But the gentleman from NBC and Comcast also mentioned that ISPs are now sitting on both sides of the table as well. So they certainly have an interest in protecting content. It's my last slide, so I wanted to provide a little more detail on how we're sort of gathering some of those performance measurements. So this is just more of a advertisement for some of the work that we're doing. We're placing these programmable gateway devices, just a NetGear router, in people's homes. That box is basically performing all kinds of measurements, both to the last mile, that's sort of the first hop outside the user's home, as well as to various servers nearby servers on the internet. The goal here is actually, it's multifaceted. Really what we want is just to get some better transparency into what the network performance actually is. So, I guess the fifth strike in this, sort of the mitigation part is, right, let's throttle the network user, right? And that's all well and good. But the other thing, of course, is that the network may not be performing well in the first place. And it's worth pointing out that it's not always the ISP's fault that it's not performing well. It may be the home user's wireless network, right? Knew you'd appreciate that. Maybe the home user's wireless network. It may be other contention inside the home, etc. So one of the things we're trying to do is provide better visibility for users into what's actually going on. So I guess you could view that as part of the education effort as well. So in summary, there are sort of technical leaps that certainly need to happen to allow ISPs to sort of inspect content for these IP protection. The common security and management tasks, many of them can be done without actually looking at the content. So detection of piracy isn't necessarily a natural technical extension. There are other interests as well that the ISPs may have, and it's certainly worth exploring whether or not various incentives can be better aligned, both with pricing mechanisms and other things. So that's all I have to offer for now.
Great, thank you. Why don't we hear from our next panelist, and then we'll have all four of you sit up front and take questions.
Certainly.
So
I'll take a seat. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let's start with Depoorter from UC Hastings Law.
Good. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the psychology. The words education and psychology have been mentioned, and that happens to be the area that I've been working in. I'm a lawyer, economist, but I've been working with psychologists on a number of projects that try to gather information about copyright enforcement as it has been put into practice, and specifically a number of variables here. So the deterrent effect of the different possibilities of enforcing copyright law in a digital environment, how it impacts personal norms and beliefs among computer users and file sharers, how it changes individuals' perception of what the community standards are and what they think others are, the beliefs of others are, and some actual behavioral adjustments. And so the deterrence is one aspect. How much it scares people, how it actually changes behavior is something that we also can independently try to measure. Okay. So we all know there's some the terms complications enforcing in a digital environment, and Daniel will talk more about that, about how no matter what enforcement policy you have, you get mitigation, you have scale effects, and so I won't really talk about this, and then focus mostly on the aspect relating to the norm-based complications. Why is this not doing a better job? I'll just stand here. Okay, so norm-based complications, we know that there's a certain normative component to file sharing, right? There's other individuals believe that they should be allowed to use technology in a certain way, they should be allowed to download things that are in the books illegal, but they feel is fair if you download something that you would never have bought. The sympathy with the artist model, right? I'll go to the concert, buy the T-shirt. Without file sharing, I would never have known the artist. There's a great paper by Yuval Feldman, which basically asks young individuals why and in what circumstances they think file sharing is moral, and situations where they think it's immoral. And there are some gray zones. There are some situations that are in copyright law clearly illegal, but that are considered, some amounts of sharing are considered relatively harmless according to some young individuals. And this is obviously, I'll talk a little bit more about this, also a generational thing. A lot of this has to do with technology and young individuals, how they are using it. I'm not talking about that small sub-community. We all know, and this has been raised before, the hardcore computer nerd, obviously he will not be deterred. He's got too much time, doesn't have rent to pay, he's living with his parents. We know it's not going to happen. But they play a relevant role in the deterrence story and the complications Daniel will talk about. They make sure that there are mitigation tactics available. And I think the role of this guy here, right, makes norms more important. Because even if you say, well, I'm not interested in the hardcore computer geek, this guy makes the normative beliefs important that the general public has, right? That's why it's important that education is rightly singled out as an important target, because when technology keeps changing and giving opportunities, it's the underlying normative beliefs that you want to change, because the technology, you can really, that's going to be out there no matter how many systems you do. Just a little note, I have a paper on technology and uncertainty. I think a lot of the norm-based beliefs have to do with something that you can't really stop, is that people use technology often in a situation when revolutionary new technology raises novel legal questions. And in that ambiguous time zone, right, and it takes years before many of this classic litigation is resolved, within those years of time, people start using the technology. And so some of those norms become internalized by the time the legal issue is clearly resolved. And so a lot of what I'm talking about is about changing norms that are there. I think from a content owner perspective, it's not realistic to think that you will be able to prevent norms from coming about. It's about changing the norms once they are in place, and delay is something that I believe, judicial delay, which you can't really avoid, is something that allows norms to build. Anyway, so a research summary on the psychology of enforcement, and I'm going to link this to the new alert system and how that might play into the bigger picture. So my research is with psychologists. Our methodology is one where we basically use all types of enforcement regimes as independent variables. So we present, mostly it has been undergraduates and graduate students, with scenarios of enforcement. Some get this scenario, some get the stringent enforcement modality presented, others get high probability, and as you'll see, I went through all the different models in the most recent studies. And so we give them, this is hypothetical, that's not being imposed upon them in the laboratory or in the room where we are conducting the experiment. This has some weaknesses, right? We're not measuring actual behavior, we're actually statements about behavior. On the other hand, there's no real reason to lie, it's anonymous, and so that helps it a little bit. A weakness is it's not actual behavior, but it has some strengths. This is what we call internal validity. In a laboratory setting, you can control things better, and so we can talk more clearly about causality than external validity studies and some of the studies Daniel will be talking about, where you measure actual behavior, but you have more noisiness because you have a whole world. Here we're controlling for a lot. I think it is complementary to some of the other research, and together it paints a helpful picture to understand psychology and behavior in copyright enforcement. Okay, so a first paper published several years ago now was about litigation strategy, and it really was about this. So it was the initial case of the initial 3 strands of litigation conducted by the record industry, and the statement about it being educational. I think it's 100% correct what Steve said about information. Certainly the litigation, stream of litigation provided information that things were illegal that some thought was okay. And that was about ambiguity. But when in the first paper what we looked at, it does it really also educate people into what they believe in their norms and belief system, right? So other than know, there's one question to know whether something is legal, and the other question is, well, this is an odd question. Should it be legal or illegal? Does litigating, does it say something about community values, for instance, that then people say, well, okay, it is illegal. Now, as in this study, I think this is a unique study, will go down in history as the last study that could do a significant sample of file shares and non-file shares. You probably don't get to high enough numbers in these groups these days, but back then we had significant numbers of file shares and non-file shares. File shares were non-responsive. No matter what the enforcement regime was, whether it was high in probability or severity of the sanction, file shares, they believed they should be able to file share and nothing would change that. Non-file shares, we did observe a educative effect in the broader sense. Not just the information, but also, this is being litigated, must be that there's something wrong with file sharing, right? Society seems to disapprove about this. There's one disclaimer, though, and that is that, and it's illustrated by this slide, is that for potential file sharers, people not file sharing, so it's this line, depending on the enforcement regime, a more strict enforcement regime with higher sanctions, right, versus lower sanctions, you see this line moving up, change the expectation of those non-file sharers about the behavior of others in society. So when there was heavy litigation and, say, statutory damages applied, it gave them an indication that, well, since there's so much activity here and from an enforcement side, it must be that a lot of people are doing this. So expectations of downloading was higher. Now, this doesn't happen with file shares. They know how many people are downloading. They could see it at the time. This was, we were still basically using peer-to-peer technology that shows how many people are online. So that's not going to make a difference. So this is what's kind of a mixed result for the industry in our research, at least, our bullet point, because even though you get the educational effect with non-file shares, you do give them a sense that, well, a lot of people are doing it, and that's kind of a mixed message, right? If a lot of people are doing it, can it really be that normatively wrong? Now, okay, this was the earlier research. We followed up with a study on copyright backlash, which is forthcoming now in USC Law Review, and here we basically the non-file shares are basically out of the picture, and what we looked at is the behavior of individuals depending on the intensity of downloads. So occasional, average, and frequent file shares, more than 150 downloaded songs in their lifetime. So not that intense necessarily. And so we looked again at how different enforcement modalities, mostly stronger, heavier sanctions versus higher probabilities, lower probabilities. So basically 4 types of enforcement. All groups of file sharers were relatively anti-copyright, anti-industry, and they were more so when enforcement became more stringent. And so on a Likert scale of 1 to 7, and this responding to some items that we asked, how do you feel about copyright law and so forth, that was relatively anti-copyright. So we're here almost at 5 every time, and especially when when we presented them with enforcement conditions that were high severity, high probability, the norms were relatively anti-copyright to begin with. Similarly, the policies of the music industry, how do you evaluate them? The more stringent the sanction was, the more negative the perception was of the industry. That's of course to be expected. But we were interested in frequent file shares. And so what we noticed is that we observed a backlash effect. And so we had I won't go into the details here now, but in the setup of the study, we introduced a second stage where we said, okay, in this prior situation, enforcement regime looked like this. Now there's a new technology that shields you from any enforcement, something revolutionary, you're anonymous. How much do you download? And so that was really trying to gauge how the norms affected the behavior when deterrence was absent. Now this is pretty realistic given that technology always changes. And what we noticed is that there was a backlash effect among frequent users. Only the ones that were really using technology frequently. And I think this goes into the story that you really talk about the more people use the technology to internalize the norm. And you're really dealing with someone who is different, right? Who has internalized norms and who reacts differently to enforcement. Now, we've heard before that this is not what the current goal is, these frequent users, right? But at the same time, as I was in my discussion with Kenneth over the break, those are actually the consumers of ESP providers once they graduate and get off their college network. So I think the generational divide that is sometimes used in this debate is a false one in the sense that it's only temporarily, because the rotten generation is going to be the consumer of tomorrow, and tomorrow is pretty early on. So I think these individuals are important, frequent users. They exhibit backlash effects, and we observed something interesting as well, is that they downloaded more depending on how stringent enforcement was before. And also, I don't have that slide up here, an interesting thing, we actually played with the enforcement regimes, and we gave them equivalent deterrent situation, where the expected costs of downloading were the same. And we just made variations. In one we raised the probability, and in others we raised the sanction, but they were the same, right? So one was 10% chance of $100, say, and the other was 1% of 1,000, 10,000. And so it's equivalent. And we observed the behavioral effect, even though they should be just as deterrent or the same normative response. It were sanction regimes that emphasized not the probability, but the sanction that were reacted to most adversely. Okay? So raising the probability of getting caught did not create as an adverse effect. And I think that's an interesting takeaway for the industry, in that my interpretation, the best interpretation I've come up with that, is that, well, whether you can get caught is something that depends on technology as well as activity. Whereas raising a sanction is something that the industry completely controls. And so you can more attribute it to someone, and that might generate more resentment. And so I'll link that to the alert system in a few minutes.
It must be risk aversion.
Yeah, but most of the studies that we've seen on tax evasion actually have the opposite behavioral effect. That probability is a higher deterrent, but here we have sanctions being a higher deterrent.
Well, that's because there's a lot of non-penalty sanctions, social and other.
Yeah, I'll say a little about the non-penalty sanctions in a minute. Okay, so anyway, to conclude this second study, is our main findings were that stringent sanctions were strongly deterrent, stronger than probability. And that was different from the tax studies. But it produces norm backlash, especially among frequent users. And we kind of concluded that paper by raising the issue that enforcement is a bit of a double-edged sword, right? Deterrence and norms work at cross purposes. Effective deterrence under the litigation system probably does require these statutory damages, right? $600,000 for 10 songs, right? But at the same time, it's counterproductive from the norm perspective. And that is potentially harmful for the industry or the content holders, in that norms are difficult to ignore. You really do have to focus on education. And our overall opinion was that if the goal really is education more than information, the litigation strategy is one that fails. I believe that the frequent users are the consumers of tomorrow, and you're not educating them. You know, it's like if you go to educational school, hardly ever is it advised to use sticks in the classroom, right? Carrots are more useful, but then again, what are the carrots here? Okay, and also we're working on, yes, go ahead.
Just a question. When you talked about what the sanction was, what was it exactly? Was it the model of 600,000 for 10 songs?
Yeah.
Was it what was?
Yeah, we actually, this was before the actual case, so we looked at the statutory damage remedy. We had $10,000 per downloaded song, right? Which is still below the statutory possibilities,
but
right?
in the real world, in terms of...
Yeah, the 3,000. Yeah, the supplements, the 3,000.
Right.
Yes, that's not what we use. So that's what we're doing in the most recent study. I'll get to that in a second.
These are experiments or surveys?
These are they're survey experiments. We're manipulating the independent variables, but we're doing it on paper. So we have people in a room and they're filling it in.
But when you raise the sanctions, it doesn't come out of their pocket.
No, that's
an experiment.
Yes, it is an experiment. Yeah, it would be impossible.
If we had a $10,000 sanction.
No.
You don't get a lot of college.
And we can't, that would be a problem. We wouldn't get past the board. And also we can't measure the actual, this type of manipulation, the type of internal validity that we're going after in causality is impossible to replicate in a laboratory setting because it's illegal as well, the behavior that we're trying to measure, right? But that's why we also have Daniel in the room who will talk about it.
But you could have $100 sanctions in an experiment to make sure, you know.
Yeah, but then you would impose it for them saying that they're going to download, right? Because you can't have them actually download it.
Sure. You have an experiment in which there's legal and illegal content.
You got a very strange sample.
Yeah, your board would not allow, I wouldn't get this past the scientific board. It would just not happen. They wouldn't allow it.
Well, okay, we'll talk about that.
Can you wrap up in a few minutes?
Yeah, I'm getting there. So normative, so in the paper we've said, you have deterrence, you can have normative over deterrence, and take a look at the paper for more. Okay, I want to get to today's topic. Recent developments in copyright law. A lot has happened since those studies, right? We've had the statutory damages applied. We've got the reverse class action initiatives, right? And the lawyers gathering talking to an author saying, let's collect all the claims against people who've downloaded your movie. Let's go after that. We have France with the 3 strikes law. And so what we wanted to do in a recent study is basically, as independent variables, use everything we've seen so far. Right? So individual suits, we give up, right? Which was the announcement at some point, but we'll talk to ISP providers. Statutory damages, reverse class actions, agreements with service providers, the French one, and now the 6 alert system we've just added to that study. We're still gathering data. We started doing this in June, and then in July the news came, and so I'm adding another one. This is the French one. So what I'm about to tell you is relevant to the extent that you accept some similarities between French and the alert system. Well, there is some. But that's what we use so far, that's what I have data on. So this is preliminary results. Can't say much yet about statistical significance, but I've been doing this for a while. I'm pretty sure what I'm telling you now will not be completely reversed later on. Okay, so our sample, this was 1L students starting their year. How much they download? On average, they're in the group of 51 to 100 songs and less than 10 movies, but more than 1. And that's a pattern that's pretty consistent. The probability of being enforced today among 1L law students is pretty low. So how many daily vouchers will face repercussions? 2.34 on a 1 to 9 Likert scale. So 1 is very few, and so on the median is 2.34. So people don't really think, they say very few will face it. What are the chances of getting caught and prosecuted? Less than 1 in a million. What are the chances of getting detected receiving a letter from ISP or RIAA? 1 in 10,000. And then what will eventually be caught? Less than 1 in a million. Okay. Now then this was just general, the population. Then we introduced some enforcement, all of the enforcement systems, and measured how this affected the deterrence, how it affected the normative beliefs, and how it affected the behavior. But first of all, also this one, what do they believe about file sharing today? One else, downloading music is immoral. Very much so, would be 9, and they're stuck at 3.5. 1 is not at all. Right? Downloading movies illegally is immoral. This was actually surprising. I thought that given the production cost of movies, this would be much more, that there would be perceived to be more immoral. Haven't found that so far. 3, the public thinks that peer-to-peer is immoral. No, we're not there at 9, but here this is interesting, right? Peer disapproval of peer-to-peer downloading. Almost no one thinks, not 1L, basically thinks that they will face disapproval for downloading. But they do think that more people of the general population do that. So that's probably a generational thing. Okay, now get to the main point, and then I'll wrap it up. So how does the litigation settlement strategy, and here I did use the $3,000 settlement on average model. How does that compare to a strike policy, right? ASP strike policy. Not the exact content alert system that I haven't implemented, but the French model, right? Because we presented students with the scenarios here as a newspaper clipping describing the regime. Okay, probability of apprehension. I guess there's some good news for some people in the room. Litigation and settlements, that when you prod students and tell them this is the model as it's been doing, the numbers get better than what I presented before. Right? Less than 1 in 10,000, less than 1 in 10,000. How likely that you will continue down music? 5 out of 9 is unlikely. But here the numbers of an ISP letter strikes policy, the way it's been done in France at least, gets you better numbers in terms of deterrence. About 1 in 1,000, 1 in 1,000, and how likely is it that you will download music? You have 3 out of 9, right? So at least as a deterrent, it seems a more credible regime to the respondents in our study. Okay, what about normative evaluation? It's the last slide. How do they feel about it? Is this again a hard shove, or is it a gentle nudge? Does it create backlash? Okay, so here it is. So I just 2 items. There's many more. One of them was the policy of the music industry conflict with my sense of justice. So it conflicts with my sense of justice. I agree. I fully agree. Would be a 9 here. And we see that litigation settlements do more poorly, create more adverse reaction than a strikes out policy. And that's the French one, right? So, you know, this alert policy might be even more here. So that's at least good news from the industry's perspective. I'm of the opinion that the music industry is conducting unjust, disproportionate policy. Again, a difference of about almost 2 knots on the scale of this 9-point Likert scale. So litigation settlement is considered to be more normatively unjust or disproportionate than the strikes out, and that's the French one. So that is some initial information, some initial data on this. Our preliminary findings on this is that it's going to be more credible. It's going to be more of a personal deterrence. Somewhat normatively suspect, but maybe less so than the litigation letters. Other information for that, even a 3 strikes you're out model on the French model, from what we've seen so far, does not lead individuals to believe that overall peer-to-peer levels will go down, even though they won't say it. But that doesn't matter, right? Unless you really believe that expectation of what others are doing drives their own behavior more than their own fear. That's different. Also, I have some questions here about the public choice aspects about this. You know, there's a certain sense that copyright law is owned by the content owners, and so the White House involvement here might add to that sense. I haven't got any conclusive data on this yet, but I'm looking into that as well. Okay, that's just it for now.
All right, thank you. So we'll move on to our next presentation by Daniel Castro, the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation.
Great, thanks. So I don't have any slides today, so you'll just be hearing from me. I thought it was interesting in the description of the event. I think it said, is this graduated response a efficiency-enhancing compromise or an abomination? And so far we haven't heard from the abomination side, and I won't be providing that, but hopefully maybe that'll be the fourth panelist. What I want to do today is really touch on kind of three different things. I want to provide a little bit more context to what I think the first panel was talking about the state of piracy today, and go into kind of why graduated response is being considered right now, kind of looking at how we've evolved with different policy response options, and then jump kind of ahead and look at the MOU on graduated response in the U.S. and look at some of the issues that are raised there. So first, starting off, what's the state of online piracy today, or why is there such a need for action here? And as was alluded to earlier, online piracy is obviously a very large problem, and one of the problems that is there is that there's not a lot of good data about the economic impact and the impact on networks. But there is a lot of studies out there, and they do all generally come to the same type of conclusion, that it is substantial. Recently, Envisional released a study where they did their own assessment of the impact of piracy and trying to measure it. And what was interesting about their study, not only was it kind of one of the most comprehensive studies I've seen, but they also compared their own to Sandvine and some of the others that have come out to put it in context. So their finding was that 24% of global internet traffic is attributable to infringing content, or 1 in 4 bits online is infringing content. And then they kind of broke that down, and they said 11% of the traffic is BitTorrent. Cyber lockers account for about 5.1% of that. So cyber lockers, in this case, they were looking at RapidShare, Mega Upload, and a few others. And then streaming sites are about 1.4%, so Mega Upload. And these are all for infringing type of streaming, not Netflix or anything like that. They also look specifically at P2P. Sometimes you hear the argument that, P2P has, it does have legitimate and illegitimate uses, but, what's the extent of each of those? Their finding was that 63.7% of the material on P2P networks are infringing content, and that's non-pornographic material. If you include pornographic material, which is pretty much the rest of that percent, they didn't assess the infringing status of that. But I think we haven't seen a lot of creative content licenses for pornography, so we can assume most of it's infringing. This is the Envisional study that came out. It's a UK-based company. I think it came out in January 2010 or 2011? 2010. But what was interesting here is that, it also reflects the changing nature of piracy, both in terms of how it's delivered and how users are consuming it. I think, one of the most striking findings that everyone sees when you're on the internet is if you do a search for, I did one this morning, watch X-Men First Class. And the results on a Google search result on the first page are pretty much always links to, streaming sites or other piracy-related sites, even though now, the industry has migrated and they do offer more and more content online. The argument before used to be, well, industry doesn't provide content, users are just going to download it because that's the easiest way. Well, Amazon, not only can you buy the DVD, of course, you can also, watch these movies, through a rental or purchase online. But you see, that's not where users are gravitating, and that's not where users are even directed automatically. You also see the growth of sites that appear to be legal. Even sites like Legal Sounds or other all of MP3 Russian clones that purport to be, reimbursing and providing legal content, when in fact copyright owners are not being provided this content or providing compensation for the content. So, when you look at this changing dynamic, you see that, piracy online isn't just about, the college kids in their dorms trading files online. It's actually increasingly more kind of a business model for some entities. There's a Spanish study that came out about a year ago on BitTorrent, and they were looking at where did the content originate, and they found that it actually came from a very small group, about 100 there were about 100 publishers that were responsible for 67% of the content, which translated to 75% of the downloads on their BitTorrent sample. And most of these were really kind of in some way a for-profit publisher. So they were trying to monetize this pirated content. So we kind of established that piracy is growing, and it's changed over the years. You also have to look back, and we talked about this a little bit, how the different types of responses from industry and from government and from ISPs and all the different players has changed, and that there have been different attempts at various times to deal with this problem. You have copy protection measures, which has more or less been a failure in the sense that material still is it finds its way online. We have civil lawsuits that have generally been unpopular and expensive and haven't had a large deterrent effect. In the long term, we have education, and education in this case meaning kind of public campaigns. Don't copy that floppy type campaigns, and those generally haven't shifted consumer expectations and consumer norms, as we've seen. And then, of course, we've had new business models, and this has helped change the equation, but new business models can't compete with free, and they can't compete when they're not, in the search results. So what you've seen now is, increasingly intermediaries are being called on to play a bigger role in policing online behavior, and this goes outside of just intellectual property. This is really a larger discussion that policymakers and others have about the internet and how it changes. You see this outside of IP. You see it for online gambling, the sale of cigarettes online, or other goods, alcohol. We've seen recently, of course, a large settlement with Google for illegal pharmacies or Canadian pharmacies. So in this case, pharmacies are actually legal in other countries but are illegal within the jurisdiction of the United States. And all these different intermediaries are being called on to police aspects of the internet and user behavior. And it's not, just ISPs. It's domain registrars, ad networks, payment processors, even shipping companies, DNS service providers, search engines. They're all kind of being brought in here. The reason for this in terms of piracy is because of the way the business model has changed. So now the goal is, what's the most effective way to get to the root of the problem? How can we, change the economics of piracy? And so if you think about it from that perspective, there are, of course, different things you can do. You can cut off revenue streams. You can try and decrease eyeballs if you're getting paid for, if someone's paying for the content or you're getting advertising revenue from the pirated content. Or you can make publishing more expensive in some way, whether it's through higher deterrent, higher punishments, or through just kind of technical measures such as UGC sites using content identification technology, so that the cost of taking stuff down is a lot lower. If it takes you a week to get one streaming movie taken down, it takes 30 minutes to put it back up. That's not a very good equation. So changing these types of equations is one way that we're seeing a shifting dynamic in this area. And so, I think that kind of gives a framework for why we're moving in this direction. But what I think is interesting here is with P2P, which is what the MOU deals with, a lot of the current mechanisms aren't very effective in that space, right? Because P2P is, in some ways, less profit-driven. When it is individuals, when it is the larger entities, there is profit motive in there. And then this kind of shifting role of intermediaries now playing a bigger role. And that's becoming kind of an accepted practice, and I think that's one of the reasons why they're kind of successful in moving forward with this in a number of countries. So what I want to do now is, kind of let's go forward and talk about the MOU a little bit. To maybe set a little preface to this, I think overall it's good for consumers in the sense that, as we talked about before, a lot of this was happening already. This is setting a single framework for all users, so I think the policies are going to be more clear. It's going to be more transparent to people what's going on, and it's also a very good kind of experiment, which is what we've seen with past policies and what we want to see going forward. How can you kind of rapidly deploy new policies, test them out, see if they're effective, see if they're cost effective, and then go forward with them. But of course, one of the key issues to look at, I think, kind of with this experiment is the effectiveness of the technology to identify infringing conduct. So infringing conduct meaning both identifying the actual content that is infringing and identifying and associating that to specific users. There are, of course, some countermeasures available to users, whether it's blocking some IP addresses that might be used for detection. We're using VPNs, but by and large, we don't need 100% effectiveness to make an impact. And presumably, consumers would rather spend, $5 or $10 a month on buying legal content than buying a VPN service to hide so that they can, download illegal content, which is kind of the option they'll be having. Another problem, of course, is dealing with false positives, or what do you do if you're an innocent consumer? And of course, there are structures in place to deal with this, but it does shift the burden of proof a little bit onto the consumers to now prove their innocence. Presumably, if the system is highly robust, this won't be much of an issue. And this is the same type of debate we see with other types of kind of automated technologies to punish users. Red light cameras is a perfect example of this, where you can't do much if you get the picture in the mail of your car going through a red light. I've gotten one in the past, and actually my wife got it because the car was registered in her name, and I was the one driving it, so she got the ticket. But what are you going to do, right? But you do, if you've ever been caught unfairly in a kind of bureaucratic system, you do want to make sure there is a kind of escape measure. So evaluating this and how this works, I think, will be very important for the industry and for people watching this as we go forward. And then transparency and accountability of the ISPs and content owners within the system and how the system works, I think, will be equally important. Currently, I think, again, this is good for consumers because part of what the organization is doing is documenting the policies that will be in place, both for the content owners and the ISPs, what methods and methodologies they're using, the technologies they'll be using. And then, as was said, an independent expert will be reviewing this. I think, the structure of how the independent expert is kind of put into this framework will be very important. Whether the degree of independence they have, what they'll be able to do, what they'll be able to publish about their findings. I think finessing that aspect will be important going forward as part of this experiment. But there's really a lot that can be learned in that area because there are, conflicts of interest in many other types of similar relationships. Auditor-client relationships experience the same kind of dynamic where you have someone hiring you to, provide oversight of something that maybe you really don't want a lot of oversight of. So there are plenty of mechanisms in place to do that appropriately, and so hopefully we'll be able to learn from that going forward. I do want to just pull in a little bit of data from France because they did, this was 18 months ago when they passed the law, and then it was implemented, I think, 9 months later, so they've had about a year's worth of data. And they just recently, the Hadopi, or whatever you call it, the French organization, released their statistics for the past year about their notice and their notice system. And so they had 650,000 first-time warnings that were issued over the past 12-month period, and then 44,000 second-time warnings. So what that shows you is that either A, it was really effective, or B, they're not really good at identifying people a second time. Hopefully it's that they're really effective, and this is just the first report that's come out, and we'll be seeing more data on that. They did have 60, it's a 3-strike regime. They had 60 third-time warnings, and a third-time warning can lead to a fine of 1,500 euros or a 1-month suspension of internet service. I believe, and this was secondhand source because my one-semester French did not cover things like piracy and copyright. So I believe nobody has actually been penalized yet, but they're in the process that they could be at least 60, or they could, of course, appeal. So I think the data is still out about whether it's working. The data is still out also on the cost of this. This was in France, it's a little distinct from the U.S. because the U.S. is all market-driven and private actors, versus in France it's more of a government policy. So who's paying for it is a little bit different there, and maybe how effectively they're doing it is questionable. But what's great when you kind of compare the U.S. system to the French system then is that the U.S. system is much more flexible. If it doesn't work, we can scrap it very quickly. We're not locked into a multi-million-dollar a year, million euro a year environment where we have nobody wants to be in that. But if it does work, it's also interesting to see how it can be extended to other environments. Whether, as was mentioned before, extending it to other types of non-P2P infringement or other types of areas where I think policymakers are interested in saying ISPs might have a role in clamping down. So identifying a bot network, as Nick alluded to, and then maybe actually saying, we're shutting you off for a while because it's a threat to others. The last part that I'd mention here is that, what is interesting about the MOU is there is no part of that agreement saying that users will be kicked off, right? That's all kind of left external to the agreement. And I think developing clear policies around that is something that will be important and useful to consumers, whether it's part of, an industry agreement or whether it's part of a broader discussion about, kind of the right to internet access. I think it's something that will be important going forward and that will be important in other contexts as well. So I think that's it, and maybe we'll hear the abomination side next.
Thank you. We're hearing from Sherwin C. of Public Knowledge.
I think that's the first time I've ever been introduced as the abomination side, so I'm excited about that. I'm afraid I might be disappointing on that issue, because I think that honestly, just taking a look at the agreement, it's grounds for cautious optimism, and I want to go a little bit into some of the reasons for both the optimism and the caution. I think we've seen a lot of people bringing up the parallels with the DMCA and sort of the other legal regimes as notice and takedown, this being notice and notice, and then eventually some sort of mitigation measure. I think those parallels are really interesting. It's really interesting that we're drawing these parallels, because I think there's obvious differences between this and a statute, but we aren't thinking about it like a legal regime, like a statute. I mean, you look at the MOU, it reads kind of akin to a rulemaking. And I mean, obviously, it's a private agreement. But it does affect, almost every user of broadband in the United States, because, as we've heard, it's trying to bring in as many ISPs as possible so that there isn't this ability of people to run to the pirate ISP. So it is a broader policy initiative in that sense, and at the same time being a private agreement. There are advantages and disadvantages to it being a private agreement. The advantages, as Daniel just said, it's more flexible, can move faster. Even though perhaps a year is maybe 8 years of internet time, a year is a very, very short amount of legislative time. So this is something. So the fact that it only took 2.5 years to get this negotiated is actually something of a lightning speed for a major policy initiative. There might even be, because it's a private agreement, less of a normative backlash than there would be against legislation. I'll leave that to Ben to study and to figure out. And there's the advantage of it being a unified system, a more unified system that involves some technical aspects of data gathering. So we'll have a lot of interesting information that we don't get, for example, with the DMCA, because mandating data reporting requirements can get a little tricky legislatively. Now, that being said, some of the disadvantages to it being a private agreement are that, well, what happens with that data? Looking at the MOU itself, there's a lot of concern about preserving the privacy of users, which is excellent, but at the same time, a lot of that caution can bleed over into ensuring that really only a very limited number of people have access to the data. And ensuring that when the agreement has provisions that say, for example, that that the data is supposed to be limited or held by the CCI, by the Copyright Information Center, or by the independent experts, and their results are supposed to be kept confidential. Well, that can hurt the utility of that data gathering. Many eyes make bugs shallow. So hopefully, I mean, there are provisions in there, conditional, to allow the board to vote to have certain amounts of data, shared with others, and I think that would be extremely useful in trying to essentially debug the system. If the idea is to have independent experts evaluating it, then relying upon one independent expert versus a large number, I think it could be very valuable. I mean, we're talking about methodologies for detecting enforcement. This is not necessarily NSA level stuff. This is, a question of, knowing the methods of detecting infringement aren't going to provide so many new and innovative ways of evading that enforcement. I mean, I think we're all pretty clear on what's going on here. The existing methods of people evading it are known and not widely practiced. So I don't think that there would be a huge effect on effectiveness there. So in addition to the question of data getting us information on its effectiveness, there's also the question of accountability in terms of are we making sure that we are keeping the number of false positives down? Are we making sure that these are effective methods? And again, the idea is not just debugging on a technical perspective, but debugging from a legal or procedural perspective. Many eyes make bugs light. It makes bugs shallow. So that's sort of general issues with the way the MOU is structured, what it leaves to the details. And there are a lot of details sort of left unfilled in by the MOU, including what the particular methodologies are. I think it's sort of understood in the document that the methodology that the content owners are using is going to peer-to-peer networks, looking for the IP addresses of infringers who are downloading stuff, actually making sure that these people are downloading things, and or looking for the actually IP addresses of people who are sharing things, right? Trying to actually download things from them, identifying those files through a hash system or whatever, and then reporting those IP addresses. That seems like a fairly robust and usable system with a low number of false positives in it. Now, there's no guarantee that this is how it's going to work within the MOU, and there's no guarantee that it's going to be implemented rigorously. Now, we would hope that would be the case. I don't see any particular reason to doubt that just yet. But how that's implemented and what those specific methodologies are is incredibly important. The same thing for the review process, how not just what the terms of the review process are, but how it ends up being used. How do users react when they get these things? Are they going to pay attention to them? Are they going to think that it's spam? Are they going to be competing with spam or phishing reports that look like this? How is this, how are you going to differentiate these things? Again, I'm not saying that this is a reason that this is, I'm not saying this as a criticism of the process, but it's something to look out for, and it's something that would have huge effects on the effectiveness of the program. And then there's the question of mitigation measures. We have the several mitigation measures mentioned in the MOU, one of them including suspension of accounts. How those get implemented, when they're implemented, will again have huge effects on the effectiveness, on the deterrence, on the normative attitudes towards the program. And then there's the question of who is doing all of these things. Who is the independent expert? Who are the privacy experts that they're consulting with? Who is the copyright expert who's going to be looking over the judgments of the review board? Who are the reviewers? Who's on the board of CCI? And it's not just a question of the individuals who are doing this, right? I mean, you can pick a handful of people who are interested in doing this, who are good at it, who are going to be fair-minded about it, who are going to have good administrative skills. But the question is, so what happens at the end of these 4 years? How does this process continue? And what are the incentives to find people who are going to be good at this, to want to engage in this process? Are people going to be volunteering to be the consulting privacy experts? And where are you going to get them? So there's all of these details in the MOU that I think leave room for consideration, leave room for the caution and the cautious optimism. And then there's a couple of other things in the larger context. Both Keith and Steve were mentioning that this is running in parallel with existing laws, with DMCA Section 512, with acceptable use policies. And I think what's interesting about this is it's not just, it's running in parallel, but at the same time, it doesn't supersede and it's not necessarily it is not necessarily the first step. Now, administratively and practically, you would think that it would be. It's a lot easier for this automated system to run, rather than somebody to immediately issue a subpoena to an ISP, rather than somebody to immediately sue an individual user, or rather that it's easier to engage in this automated process than for an ISP to just say, hey, you violated terms of use, we're going to kick you off now. But the fact remains that all of these things are possible outside the system, and the system isn't sort of an initial prerequisite step. It's not an administrative remedy that has to be exhausted before the litigation begins. So the fact is that I think, it's possible to, I think it's easy to understate the significance of what these guys have done. They put together a complicated agreement that does a great deal, that's reached a significant compromise on this. It's also possible to overstate that a little bit, what this accomplishes. Again, it's possible for disputes to be litigated completely outside of the system. It's not, if things don't seem to be working, it's entirely possible for it to be bypassed, or for it to be for the volume of issues resolved through it to be reduced. And there's also questions about the mobility of this model in terms of, can it be applied to cyberblockers? Can it be applied to streaming? I think, it's good to see that people can come together on various sides of the issue to discuss it. But the mobility of the model isn't the mobility of private actors coming together, sitting down at a table for 2 years and arguing over it. The model, I mean, that's just private parties negotiating. The question of whether or not something much more, the question of whether or not the details that were hammered out in those 2 years can be moved into another technological sphere, I think are significantly different, because with the changing of the technology, you're changing the user behaviors, you're changing the aspects of privacy and network architecture that are involved. And so I think it's unlikely that you could just copy and paste large swaths of this to deal with some of these other technological issues. So I think that sort of sums up what I think are the questions for the immediate future on this. That we have a system that looks like it could potentially provide both deterrence and education, and yet at the same time, the actual implementation it seems like quite a while down the road. I'd definitely be interested in hearing from you guys on how far you've gone in finding additional people to fill the various roles, right? It's not just the independent expert, it's not just the members of the executive board. So those are the reasons for my cautious optimism on this. So thanks, and I think we can do Q&A.
Yeah, thank you. Why don't we get the 4 panelists for this session up front? And I said that I would give our panelists in the first panel first dibs on having some reaction/questions, and then we'll open it up again to the floor. Only if they have any questions, not required to comment if you don't want to.
I don't have a question, because a lot of what you're saying, obviously we would have to yes, the data that our panelists have, but they were the things we thought about during the discussion. We're worried about the effect it would have on customers and how effective it is. We're worried about the social, psychological overlay. And those are the things we debate. So most of what I heard, all the comments that I heard, are the things that were part of the baseline to which our negotiations.
Okay, Steve, do you want to say?
I agree with you.
Okay, and do we have any broader questions?
Curious about the issue of response to three strikes approach versus existing approach. backlash, deterrence, et cetera. One of the things that's hard here is we are bundling expectations. I mean, we've done some rather extensive empirical studies and actually watching how many people are transferring copyrighted files and on college campuses, and often we measure these things. I know, for example, on a college campus, the majority of college students we see are actually transferring copyrighted files today. The number that get some kind of response is pretty close to negligible, but the penalty is high, right? That's our current system. As you move to another system, it was assumed that that would change. And it was assumed that we had a process change that involved multiple strikes. And it was assumed that the ISPs were involved. I mean, there are multiple things going on, and I'm wondering if we can pull them apart and figure out which of these things make people think there's less of a backlash. In particular, outside of this MIOU is how it's actually going to be done, and what the false positive and false negative rate and all of those things. Is it swarm infiltration? Is it IP-based, address-based? Is it DPI-based? We'll determine those things, and that's all kind of outside. So if we know which of the factors make the backlash go down, for example, that would be really useful. I don't know if you can pull that.
Well, I think we've had interesting, I think the argument that was made was, well, we have termination as the stick at the very end, but we don't think we need to use it because that's our empirical estimation is that with notices it will never come to that. But I felt a little uneasy about that because it's the stick probably that generates the highest backlash. When you look at studies on Adobe, people think general population thinks it's disproportionate that copyright infringement could lead to you not being able to pay your electricity bills conveniently, get to your bank account. So termination is, from all the studies we have on backlash, termination is what creates the highest amount of resentments because it's too disproportionate. Now, a notification policy is not termination, but if it's just notification without termination, it's a whole different thing. It's still notification towards termination. And I think the interesting question is, and I like the fact that we'll have some, it's almost an experimental study that you guys are setting up for 4 years, is that I like that different service providers will be doing it in a different manner. Because there's a way in which you can notify, and there's a way in which you can follow up, and there's a way in which you can, through procedural measures, clear out some of the ambiguity and give a voice to consumers that allows them to separate themselves from the clear infringers to the ones that are, downloading something they have DVR'd, right? But I'm not sure that's going to happen, right? Because it costs time and money to listen to the arguments that people give, and I'm not sure, how do you verify that someone says, well, I downloaded Grey's Anatomy because I had DVR'd it and my husband deleted it because he didn't want us to watch it, right? And so how do you go about assessing that? And I think any cost-effective measure is one that's probably going to generate a lot of backlash because people don't feel they're heard. And so it's going to be interesting how it plays out. But
was that, for example, something that you heard as one of the reasons for the backlash? Was that, gee, there's so many things like DVRing that people felt like they were using it for, because that's candidly inconsistent with what we generally encounter in terms of, people know what they're doing and they're using it for a certain purpose. The backlash may exist in terms of their own feelings about proportionality.
Yeah, there's one interesting aspect about what we've discovered in the studies is that, and that's what in the conversations with my psychologist co-authors, is that there's a self-interested root of a lot of the normative attitudes. Right? So the frequent file sharers, they want to, and this cognitive dissonance really is the term. You want to believe that it's okay, and you want to blame the copyright system so you can keep doing it clearly, because you want to have reason not to like the industry. And so observing any of those things in the gray zone is a justification, right? And so any information that goes into the media about ISPs and how they are implementing it, any situation where an ISP makes a false positive mistake is going to be highlighted and used in that normative fight. So that's where I think where it comes together. So to answer the question, I think the stick is one thing, it's out there, that generates some backlash, but the procedure on getting there is going to be crucial, and whether there's real filtering, because even the folks that are downloading intensively, they're looking at the gray zone to justify it. They want to see it's disproportionate all the way, so it doesn't matter that I do it clearly erroneous.
I think just to follow up on the point of bundling expectations or bundling variables, I think that's true, and I think the fact that you're going to have different ISPs implementing different ways, different content owners implementing in different ways, can be a real advantage, but only if you have that data recorded in the system. If you have the text of the notices and sort of the timing at which they're sent, then you can actually start to try and compare them with each other and pull out, what might have caused what sorts of numeric effects. But if you don't keep that, you'll have no chance, and it will just be sort of one homogenized mass.
Yeah, the danger is that if you don't have a clear record, you're going to have people picking cherries, maybe on both sides, right? But one of the things that, there's a community out there that has this anti-position, right? And this whole setup and the way it's implemented will give them more ammunition to say, oh, see, it's disproportionate. And if you don't have a complete record to say, no, we have done all these things in the correct instances, so I would recommend to really document everything that happens in review and to have some empirical data, not just for the society as a whole, but also to counter some of the colorful painting that's been going on also about the settlement.
And an interesting point about that, because there's an elaborate review mechanism in the MOU. It does not call for, full-blown legal opinions in response to each review case. They're supposed to just issue, in most cases, a brief written description of why, if they did, they rejected the defense that was raised. But now this thing that you're raising, this idea, this notion that some people have to say, well, as long as I, at some point, possessed a copy that I gained legitimately, if something happened to that, I'm entitled to, in effect, back it up or replace it through facially illegal downloading. All right, now, the only one of the possible defenses that you could attempt to use for that would be some sort of fair use argument. And under, that's probably not a winning fair. I mean, a lot of people would argue that it is, but
the notices are sent based on the distribution, not on the download. The fact that it's in somebody's share folder and has been
right, that's another point.
Available and down. Right. So the fact that that just doesn't.
So the guy who downloaded isn't going to get the notice. It's going to be the guy who's got it in there, who's seeding it, or who's.
Methodology.
Which often is just the guy forgets to take it out of the file sharing folder, right?
More likely doesn't know it.
Yeah.
But if you're warned once.
That's
right. How many times can you dog eat your homework?
This way, you're able to make that fit.
In your Janny's house. Quick, Professor Depoorter, I just have a quick, I wanted to ask about one quick question about your studies, and then just ask talk about the methodology. Your results seem to be kind of different from the results, significantly, for example, finding that frequent file shares aren't really deterred. Seem to be very different from the results of the studies that admittedly limited that have been done that actually looked at real-world behavior. For example, the Fairfax study, where they followed a group of high-volume users of Kazaa during the first year, between the time that enforcement, the possibility of enforcement was announced, and the time that the lawsuit was filed. And you end up with the median number of files shared among that group of high-volume users dropping from 227 to 11.
Yeah, can I respond? Actually, that's not correct. The file shares are deterrent. The frequent file shares are deterrent, but they have no normative adjustments. And so when deterrence goes down, they really pick up again.
So it
is deterrent on all groups.
And that's sort of my other question is, when you're setting up, because I think you just actually mentioned it, when you're setting up this sort of, these experiments, are you actually putting them in a position where they're able to understand just how bad their normative argument really is? Because it's one thing to basically set it up so it's, oh, look, here's the big bad news, copyright industry is trying to sue you. It's quite another if you know, oh, by the way, LimeWire said that we should enforce copyright by suing you. Public Knowledge did, EFF did, Grokster did, Morpheus did, Google did, many major ISPs did, CNET did, when you download the things from downloads.com. When you put that into it, I mean, I suspect you get very different results. Is that information you provide to these people?
Well, what we're trying to see is what their norms are. We're trying to not affect them one way or the other, right? So we're asking very neutral questions. What do you think about, we're just trying to ask the question in different ways with the different items we've used, is just to say, how do you feel when you're downloading? Do you think people should be allowed to download? Just as such, the norms as they have been influenced by public opinion when they walk into the room, right? And then what we're trying to say as well, the industry is going to impose this, and we try to keep it neutral, not take a position one way or the other. Now, yes, it's true that each of these respondents, when they walk into the real world, they're influenced by newspaper reports and normative viewpoints one way or the other. But as psychologists, we don't want to influence that. We don't want to get directed answers.
I imagine if you had 10 times the sample size and 10 times the time and budget, you could, have a sample of students, provide them with different sorts of enforcement mechanisms, and then provide them with different pieces of information going in, grading from, anti-copyright propaganda to, the FBI warning.
Yeah, that's well. In this latest paper, what we're trying to do is give just newspaper clippings that provide the simple information, the basic of each enforcement regime. But you could also do something called priming, where you give them you give them information that has a certain viewpoint in it. And so you could even see, you could, for instance, give someone all these Wall Street Journal information and then some internet blog, right? And you could see how flexible those positions are. That would also be interesting, and that's a possible extension. But we're taking it as a given, to answer your question.
Have you also taken a look at what many colleges and universities are actually doing analogs of basically a graduated response program? I wonder whether, are you aware, I'm not aware of any academics who are doing, who are actually looking at what the effect of those programs are.
On University Network.
Yeah.
They have real field going on that.
That's right. I just wondered.
Yeah, they are not happy. It's hard to get them to disclose that information because, as a university, you don't want to be known to be either lax or stringent because they're also, they're in a competitive market and it has some effects potentially on admissions, maybe for them. I don't know. Yeah, but that's true. It's a good point. There is relevant information there to be gathered.
Because, the real world data says that there's a huge effect.
No, there is a deterrent effect, and my studies are not, the studies we've conducted are about the beliefs and the attitudes, right? And we're not measuring the actual behavior. Now, there's a lot of people that are doing this, and it's more technically oriented studies, but you can measure deterrent at one point in time, but then technology changes things. The constant is the behavioral attitudes, and that will interact with the technology. So I think it's a complement to those other studies, not a replacement.
Yeah, I think I was trying to make the point that you just made, which is that, the normative attitudes are going to persist with the individual to a certain extent, and you can measure the deterrent effect on those networks, and it's a lot more difficult to try and measure the deterrent effect across the entire technological spectrum. If somebody does say, oh, okay, these enforcement procedures are in effect for PAP, maybe I'll move to streaming, maybe I'll move to Spotify instead, and being able to measure where that goes is really difficult.
I have a question for Mr. Feamster. You said that ISPs implementing security network management don't have to look at content to know which domains are bad actors. I have two questions. One, are the actions they're taking simply blocking email emanating from those domains, or are they actually trying to block access by a subscriber trying to reach those domains? And on the email part, if you never look at the content, how do you know? Every spam filter I've ever seen, some small percentage of what it blocks turns out to be legitimate. If it's in my spam filter provided by my web hosting service, I'm able to look at what it's caught and say, oh no, that one's good, and put it on the list of what you went through, but the ISP customer probably never sees what's being blocked. So just wondering how that's all implemented.
Yeah, so... Okay. So a lot of the countermeasures that ISPs end up taking in these cases don't have such a high false positive rate. You mentioned that mistakes are made with respect to filtering, but those are kept very low. In particular, in practice, the ISPs try to get that to about 0.1% false positive rate. So the ISPs try to keep the rate very low. That also relates to the point you asked about blocking. Blocking is another thing that is a pretty sensitive topic, because again, wrong answers are they have pretty serious ramifications. If you similar to throwing a legitimate email into a spam filter or into a spam folder, if you wrongly characterize a domain as a phishing site or as a scam site and just out and out block it, and you're wrong, now you get into potentially threats against free speech and other things like that. So they're concerned about falsely blocking things. Often again, sort of coming back to some of the things I mentioned, instead what you can do are a few things. So as far as domains, there are things called blacklists that basically get maintained. What do you do with the domain on a blacklist? Well, often you don't out and out block it, but you can provide a warning to the user, right? So some browsers, for example, will use that blacklist, a blacklist as input and say, this appears to be a phishing site. You may have seen some of these warnings in browsers before. So warnings is one way, and then the other way that this can be done is on outbound, like warnings or blocking on outbound traffic rather than on inbound. So if something is blocked on receipt, right, the sender doesn't necessarily know that it's been blocked. Something's being blocked on outbound, the sender knows they've been blocked. So silent dropping, like silent wrong answers, are a very bad thing. So the ISPs are pretty careful.
I'm just curious, how do they know they've gotten the false positive rate down of 1/100% if they never look at the content? Don't they have to look at least at the sample to decide?
That's a good question. They do look at a sample, and in fact, what they do is they'll take a set of messages from the corpus, then they'll label that, typically manually or in a semi-supervised way, and then they'll do like a cross-validation using the techniques that don't involve looking at content. Yeah.
I wanted I wasn't quite clear whether you were suggesting this in the presentation or not. I understand, yes, you could use DPI to do content identification, but you're not assuming that it's necessary to do that, because because my understanding is that whether it's digital or not creating these kinds of infections to identify the content of files. They're using file hashes and the packaging.
That's true. Although the file hashes, the hashes of files also are technically in the payload of the traffic as well. So those don't typically sit in the IP.
So you would experience no more diminution in privacy than you do by using it.
I think the question that would the difference would be in who is actually receiving this information, right? If it's somebody who's been hired, an investigator who's trying to download, then they have access to what's on the network. If you're talking about the conduit, if you're talking about the ISP gaining access, that is very, very different, because they don't have access to that payload on a normal basis.
So the file hash information is part of what you would consider the packet payload?
That's definitely the case. What we talk about when we talk about headers of packets are things that you could kind of, like the analogy would be the envelope, right, of the message. So, like source and destination IP address, ports, etc. But anything below the port, if you will, we would consider that to be payload.
All right, well, let's thank our panelists, and thank you all.
I hope you know I wasn't really suggesting.
Oh, no, thank you.
That's all good.
Technical question. So they're saying we should go after people that have something available to share. As soon as you're downloading something, even when you haven't finished downloading the file, you can already be downloading from your file.
That's true. Yes, you can become a seeder before the